Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Engeler, and I'm the CEO of Shelter New South Wales, and also, most enjoyably, the Chair of National Shelter, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this afternoon's session. I'd first like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our collective respects to Elders past, present and emerging. We're very excited today to be helping to facilitate the session about large-scale investment in Australia. And before I introduce Wendy Hayhurst from CHEA, just to make the point and set the scene that it's been talked about in various forums that we need a subsidy. The market not just falls short, but it fails spectacularly in some ways. So we see a subsidy is needed at various points, and today's discussion will very much be focusing on the role, say, of the federal government in providing a subsidy in the form of a tax. But that theme about how we can provide the subsidy, where it goes, what the multiplier effect might be, and how, most importantly, I think for today's panel, community housing organisations or community housing providers are absolutely central to that process of, if we've defined the problem, that they're very much part of the solution. So I'd like to, so we'll be hearing today from Wendy Hayhurst, who's from the Community Housing Industry Association, Dr. Christian, or Dr. Andi Nygaard, as we know him, from the Centre for Urban Transitions from Swinburne University. We were going to hear from Carrie Hamilton, who sends her apologies. Like lots of people, she's been impacted by COVID isolation, so Carrie sends her apologies. But in her stead, we're very pleased to have Charles Northcote from Blue Chip. And of course, we've got Andrew Hannan from Community Homes Canberra. So I'd like you to join with me in welcoming, first of all, this panel. And I'll just ask Wendy Hayhurst, I'll sit back down and she'll give us some more context or scene setting for this afternoon's session, which is absolutely meant to be interactive. We've got the iPad here to ask questions. Very keen for the panel to be asked particular questions, not only of each other, but for you in the audience, and that means you as also watching remotely. Please ask questions. It's meant to be interactive. These are the reasons why we have these sessions live, so people can be put on the spot, answer the difficult questions. So thank you. Wendy.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. I also want to thank John for stepping in at such short notice when Gemma Pinnell, one of our partners, who's the exec director for strategic engagement at Industry Super, found herself with a migraine this morning. A real shame. So I just want to introduce this section by giving a bit of background to why we're all here today, because it's been a very long journey, I think around about 2 or 3 years that we've been working on this policy proposal. And I just want to pick up a bit on some of the discussion that we had at the session just prior to lunch, the State of the Nation, which I thought was a great session. And what Luke Bosher from Homes Victoria said, he said, we're not going to solve social and affordable housing, and I am paraphrasing a bit here, without taking a look at the systemic issues that there are that are preventing us from sorting out Australia's housing. Now, I don't say that what we're going to talk about today is the whole answer, but it's part of that answer. Nathan Delbon at that session said money isn't everything, but boy, money is a large part of what we need to solve social and affordable housing. We need to get all of those other things right, but without more investment in social and affordable housing, we're not going to go very far and we're not going to go quickly. So what we're going to talk about today is money, and how to make sure that that goes as far as possible. So I said it's been a very long journey. It's been a very long journey, but it's been a great journey. And I think to get to a position where we have now a team of people from different sectors who all believe what we're going to talk about today can fly is great. So we started quite small, and we started with the community housing industry. In fact, it's great Charles can be here, because Charles was one of the first people to join our little band when we started out on this 4 years ago, thinking about we need not just to talk to government about giving us the money, but to tell them how they could do it in a cost-effective and efficient way. And Charles has been part of that journey. So we started as a community housing industry saying, we're asking for money, so let's us make sure that we have a framework and a policy and put some dollars in ourselves to designing that. So we started there. Andy's been along on the journey with us as well, because yeah, we know roughly what we want, but we wanted someone to do research. I know that can be a boring word sometimes, but we needed to look at the evidence behind what works elsewhere, what might be a great transfer to the Australian housing context. So Andi did a lot of work to look at other systems in other countries and how they funded social and affordable housing. We then needed to pick up the finance sector, because let's face it, we want money. We know from the NIFIC review that we need, what's it, $290 billion of capital investment. Well, yeah, we need the government to stump up some of that, but we need money from elsewhere too. So we needed to get the finance and particularly institutional investors on board. So that's where we picked up on our little train going forward, our friends in the superannuation industry. First of all, it was the Industry Super Australia that came along, the big industry funds. But along the way, we've also picked up AIST, which represents all of the not-for-profit trustees. So that's the corporate sector, superannuation funds, and some of the local government and state government superannuation funds. So they're along for the journey as well, and we've tested it with them. Along the way, we've spoken to government as well. A bit harder to say that they're definitely on board, but we've kept them in the conversation all the way along, including with NIFIC as well, because we know that if this is going to fly, it's got to be something that government will take comfort in. So we've spoken to the Australian Treasury, very important. We've spoken to Prime Minister and Cabinet, as well as our colleagues at the DSS, because here we're looking for the Commonwealth Government's involvement in particular. So we've also worked with the private sector, so we've got the Constellation Project, PwC, colleagues in Mission Australia as well. So it's a band that we want to expand. Anyone can come on board, but we want to, in the words of my friend Carrie Hamilton, who isn't here today, to normalise our solution. So when we started off, we gave Andi a bit of a brief, a specification of what we wanted the housing policy to do. And the first thing we said to him is it's got to operate at scale. It's got to be the sort of solution that's going to get us somewhere near making a dent in those waiting lists, making sure that many of those people in rental stress can get access to social and affordable housing. So it's got to be capable of working at scale. The second thing we said to him is it's got to be something that happens every year. It's got to be ongoing. It hasn't got to be an initiative that we know is there for 2 or 3 years, but during that 2 and 3 years, we've got to keep arguing about what happens in year 4, 5, 6, 7. So we know this is a big problem. It's not going to go away. There needs to be social and affordable housing built every year. We've got a shortfall, but we've also got a growing population. So we need to have something that's there for the long term as well. We then said to him, it's got to leverage other sources of finance and funding. So it's got to be something the states say, God, I want a slice of that, and they put in land or other types of subsidy as well. It's got to be something that's attractive to philanthropy too. They've got to say, yep, I'll put something in because it's going to be leveraged as well. It's got to be attractive to financiers, so institutional investment. It's got to be attractive to NIFIC. So you can see you're starting to build up a bit of a brief here of things that it's got to do. It's also got to be something community housing organisations can work with efficiently. So it hasn't got to be one of those complex projects where you feel you're spending more money in the administrative arrangements than you are actually spending on the housing that is being built. And finally, it's got to be able to sort out anyone's problems. It isn't a question that it's going to just solve housing for women or people with disabilities. It's got to be able to work with any project, anywhere in Australia, at any time. So Andi, I think it's over to you really to say how you fulfill that brief.
I finally feel nervous now. We've chosen a presentation for this part because I'm going to set out some of the sort of nuts and bolts in how a solution to the brief that Wendy gave us has been put together. And I'd like to also start really by acknowledging Carrie Hamilton, who has been a really important part of this project. She's at home at the moment. If you're watching, Carrie, this is also your work, so the two of us have done a lot of this work jointly. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're speaking, as the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne. Okay, so the solution to all of the things that Wendy gave us is what we call the Housing Boost Aggregator. Now, everyone here knows that there is a lack of social and affordable housing in Australia. It isn't something that is just an issue in one state or in one capital city. This is a national problem, and we need a national level, federal level response and solution to how we tackle this problem. And a key part of that problem is that there is simply a funding gap. So the investment viability, the financial viability of investing in social and affordable housing simply doesn't stack up. And this, is a very well-known problem across housing in Australia. So insufficient income or savings is very well known if we want to assist first-time home buyers in getting into properties. Similarly, community housing organisations, they struggle to raise the finance required to build and operate new affordable housing developments that are financially viable by the standards that any lender would have to apply. So the problem simply is that the existing funds, the revenue, that is the rental income that comes, and the sources of funding that otherwise are available, they simply don't stack up in order to build social and affordable housing at scale. Yeah, they stack up in some instances, and if you do a little bit of modification here, it'll stack up there. But at the level of investment that we require, it simply doesn't stack up. So our solution, the Housing Boost Aggregator, is a solution that approaches developing these new social and affordable housing by separating out the cost that the CHOs can finance based on rental income and other sources of available funding, and that is the element that Wendy talked about. It needs to work with other forms of funding that is available, from the cost that they simply cannot borrow to fund. And this is the gap bit. And the solution to tackling this problem is, in our view, to tackle the gap, not to try to tackle everything in the stack at once, but tackle the gap, the thing that is the actual barrier. If you can get over that barrier, then lots of the other pieces actually work out by themselves. So this solution falls into two parts. There is a tax credit or a boost subsidy, which is structured as a refundable tax offset that targets this gap. And this solution builds strongly on the low-income housing tax credit in the United States. And then there's an aggregation mechanism that provides investments at scale and supports the diversity of housing needs. So an investor doesn't have to pick and choose individual developments that they want to get engaged in. They simply pick and choose the level of investment they want to make in social and affordable housing. Okay, so the first part is really a way of identifying how much of a boost does an individual project need in order to become financially viable. So the revenue from social and affordable housing is simply not enough to fund the construction and management and running of these properties, but it can fund some of that cost. And in the middle there, you see that grey layer. That is approximately the amount of construction that can be funded from the revenue that these developments and these properties will generate themselves. So we don't need to worry about that bit as much. The second bit, that there is additional forms of support. A lot of developers have their own equity. There is philanthropic money, there is assistance from state governments, there is equity injections in forms of land, etc., etc. So all of these things are the pink layers that you see at the bottom of this building here. Those also reduce the gap that remains between what is financially viable and what is not. So once you've identified those two components for individual projects, you can then say, well, this is how much is required now to top up, to simply give a boost to this proposal in order to make this development financially viable at standards that are applicable across responsible lenders. In our case, we've based it on NIFIC lending. And then find a way to support overcoming that particular gap. So step one is identifying what this gap is. And the gap has to be after crowding in. We don't want to substitute. We don't want to say, oh, here's this new source of subsidy. Let's forget about all other efforts to bring in what otherwise is available. No, we want to elevate projects that are, if you will, have a possibility of becoming financially viable with the assistance of this boost subsidy. And then there's the tender process. So community housing providers will tender for the boosts to fill that particular gap. You can think of this a little bit as a reverse auction. The point here is not to drive up the price, but to drive down the boost that is required to build housing that is affordable and appropriate and good quality housing. So obviously there will be some checks and design elements in how selections are made so that you don't drive this down to a race to the bottom. We don't want crap houses being built. We want appropriate housing being built. So you can build that into the value for money type assessment of how the tenders will be assessed. And then, on the back of that identification of what the total gap is, successful bidders or community housing organizations would receive a flow of 10 annual boost payments in the form of refundable tax offsets. They would get a tenth of whatever that gap is every year, and there'll be an additional interest, if you will, paid on top of that, which in our conversations with a lot of institutional investors typically sort of sits in the range 4.5% to 6.5%. We haven't set a specific target for that. That will be something for Treasury to determine, and it will also be something that will vary from year to year. So that provides a flow of boost payments that will top up or fill the gap that a community housing provider experiences. Now, the outstanding problem here is that simply, well, you need to build the properties now, and you'll get that money over 10 years, or you get the subsidy over 10 years. So how is that actually going to build or provide housing? So the second part of this solution is the aggregation component. So the tax credits themselves are of limited value in the construction of new social and affordable housing. However, the aggregator will facilitate converting those flows, those 10 annual payments, into upfront construction capital. So the aggregator pools all of that value in any given year and issues funds to the total value of those 10 annual payments. And investors can then purchase a share of that total value. And in purchasing a share of that total value, that flow is converted into an upfront single construction capital injection that fills that gap at the top of the funding stack. So to give a very simplistic example in this, imagine in any given year, the total pool of those gaps come to 500 million. In this case, imagine there are kind of 3 projects going forward. One is a very small one, 25 million. One is a medium-sized one, 100 million. One is a relatively large one, 375 million. They're all of different sizes. They all cater to different needs, housing needs. And it might be difficult for an individual investor to kind of target a project that they want to be involved in. They might have a limit that they think of 250 as being an appropriate amount, and none of these actually fit that level of exposure. But by pooling all of these things, a super fund can purchase simply as much of that revenue stream as they're interested in, say 250 million, and then receive via the community or via the aggregator 10 annual payments of 25 million plus an additional return on top of that. And it's the additional return that obviously makes it attractive for any investors, because that is, that gives you your return. Now, the value of a refundable tax offset is that it operates much like a cash payment. It isn't cash, but it is cash-like. Refundable tax offsets are applied after the annual tax position is established. So after you've worked out how much tax you have to pay, then you apply the refundable tax offset. And quite possibly, the result of that is that you get a negative number. Now, if that happens, there's actually a refund from the tax office. So it's cash-like. But it is, from the government's perspective, not a direct cash outlay. All right, so what do you get? Obviously, in order to qualify for tendering, these properties have to be let out to very low and low-income households for at least 20 years. So investors receive a payment over 10 years, but the properties have to remain affordable for at least 20 years. However, after that 20-year period, these properties are actually debt-free. A proportion of the properties will go to settle any outstanding debt. There will be some, depends on the modeling, but in some cases there is an outstanding debt, and that has to be settled. And typically, in our modeling, some 70 to 90% of the stock is debt-free. And that means it can either just be kept on as affordable housing, or it can be reinvested in new construction of social and affordable housing. The monitoring of these and the compliance of this is not based on an individual property basis. So you don't have to ensure that the person that lives in every individual property meets the affordability targets. It is the project as a whole that has to meet the affordability target. And that has quite important implications. It enables a lot of flexibility in how you manage that tenant profile over time. And it creates additional tenancy security for people who move into one of these properties and then find themselves getting a job. So suddenly they don't qualify any longer, but they can remain in the property. The consequence of that is that as a project manager, you need to ensure that whoever moves in next meets an affordability threshold that balances out what the total and what the project as a whole measures up in terms of affordability. So this really is a mechanism that ensures that it is the desired housing outcomes and locations that will determine the financial boosts that is provided, rather than the other way around. Rather than, here's a package of money, now see what you can do with it. And then you get housing that is tailored to what is actually possible to do with the money, rather than housing that is specifically designed to meet housing needs and priorities in individual states and areas and for different groups. The investor's risk is separated out from the operational risk. Remember, we've taken out the bits that relate to the gap. This is only funding the gap, so it's shielded from operational fluctuations. Those operational fluctuations are built in to prudential standing lenders, so yes, they will fluctuate, and yes, there will be changes in the tenant profile, etc., etc. But it doesn't spill in to what that gap is in, and hence, from an investment point of view, you're not taking a risk on variations to the tenant profile. Now, this proposal is based on an existing and long-time running mechanism internationally. We know that it works, it's tested. From a policy perspective, this is foregone revenue to government, tax offsets, rather than an annual budget allocation of money that has to be spent or not. And it draws on the creditworthiness of the Australian Tax Office. Effectively, the Australian government is the institutional investor's counterparty. So it's not a social service agency that is the counterparty in managing those flows. All right, so 3 takeaways for you. Housing Boost Aggregator splits out the obstacle, that is the problem, to financing new affordable housing construction, and then it targets that obstacle alone through a subsidy that then can be sold on to investors for upfront construction capital. And in this way, we can ensure that the Housing Boost Aggregator addresses housing outcomes and locations that are determined by what the actual need is, rather than providing housing based on the subsidy that is available and what you potentially could do with the money that is there. And it's low-risk investment. A lot of people need affordable housing. It's about 1 million of those as a shortfall to 2036. So there is a lot of people who want to live in these properties. And there's a separation from the investor's point of view of the operational risk. Right. And that takes me to the end of setting out the nuts and bolts of the Housing Boost Aggregator. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's my pleasure now to, and I don't think I'm the only person in the room, was very glad that I had that second coffee today, to be able to take that in, Andy, to move from the theory to the practice, if you like. So we're very pleased today to be able to have on the panel 3 areas of the housing industry, community housing. We saw where community housing is expressly part of the solution here. Andy's come up with the idea, here's the theory. We're now going to hear from, first of all, Andrew, then Charles, and then back to Wendy, just to hear about what would the questions of the practical people on the ground who would be charged with making this happen, what would it look like for them from their various perspectives in terms of community housing. I'll start with Andrew, if that's okay. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, John. I'd just like to start by commending the work of the band of partners, the leadership and drive of Chia's CEO, Wendy Hayhurst, beside me, Carrie Hamilton, who couldn't be here, from the Housing Action Network, the input of Industry Super, and the academic rigour of the work by Andi and his team. Community housing providers are doing a fantastic job and are being innovative in terms of getting up community housing development projects or acquisition of stock for use as community housing, leveraging in most cases NIFIC's concessional debt financing as senior debt, in some cases also layering in subordinate debt, and also any available state or local government subsidies or concessions. But this approach is not what success looks like in terms of addressing the scale of the need. The NIFIC review, which we heard parts of yesterday and perhaps earlier today as well, highlights that a $290 billion investment is needed over the next 20 years. Rod Faring, the independent chair of the National Affordable Housing Alliance, sort of mentioned that yesterday. And if we maintain the status quo, only a fraction of that investment will be forthcoming. A program approach, not a project-by-project approach, is needed to meet the scale of need. State initiatives in recent years have been beneficial, including what we've heard about here, especially in Victoria. But a national plan is needed, national leadership is needed, with a federal subsidy that complements any state and local initiatives in a coordinated manner to address the funding gap. NIFIC's Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator is necessary but not sufficient. NIFIC, under Nathan's leadership, is doing a stellar job, especially from the point of view of community housing providers, but needs complementary action, such as the Housing Boost Aggregator, again, to address the funding gap. From a community housing provider developer perspective, as the price of land and construction costs increase, and we've heard plenty about that in the last couple of days, as interest rates invariably rise, the funding gap is only going to get larger. In my dealings with institutional investors as the CEO of CHC, it's apparent that scale is key, and thus a pipeline of projects, be it new development or acquisition, is needed. Transactional costs are disproportionately high without scale. And without scale, fund managers will deploy capital elsewhere for similar or better risk-adjusted returns. Without addressing the large and growing funding gap, without certainty of government subsidy to close this gap, a project-by-project, piecemeal approach to the problem is the default. And even delivering this project-by-project approach is getting more difficult. Absent subsidy, we're seeing examples today where institutional investors are coming in and are financing specific community housing provider projects for 10 years typically, sometimes relying on volume discounts to buy off the plan or completed stock at below market value, for example. But then typically they need to recycle that capital at year 10 to meet their investors' investment and equity internal rate of return requirements, meaning that absent another party coming in or a community housing provider having a strong enough balance sheet and available cash to buy out the investor, the social and affordable housing may be lost to the community housing sector. There's clearly some parallels with what we've seen in practice from the NRAS program. Such examples are obviously better than nothing, and not providing those community housing dwellings for 10 years and not impacting the lives of the tenants of those properties for 10 years is key, but it's not what success looks like for the sector. The Housing Boost Aggregator is one model we think could be adopted by the federal government to address the funding gap problem, which is a condition precedent to being able to scale investment from non-government sources into growth of social and affordable housing supply. applied to specific projects, the Housing Boost Aggregator has the potential to make an unviable project viable, to increase the affordable rental takeout from a mixed market and affordable development, and/or include social rentals with a greater boost received, to reduce community housing provider reliance on its own cash holdings, to address any equity shortfalls to make a project stack, and therefore continued ability to grow its impact over time, or activate greater contribution. And this is a really key point, and Andi sort of flagged this too, and Wendy. It's not about displacing other sorts of capital. It's not about taking away the need from those pink layers. It's about leveraging that, and in fact, potentially even activating greater contribution from state and territory governments or local governments to make projects in their jurisdiction competitive for the boost. So in conclusion, one way to deal with the funding gap, so this is one way to deal with the funding gap, to create a program solution that addresses the exam question set for Andi of scale, ongoing nature, leveraging other sources of financing, such as land, philanthropic contributions, and not displacing them, being attractive to financiers, being efficient for community housing providers to work with, and to work with any project, anywhere, at any time. And I'll close with Nathan's comment, just to reinforce it, that money isn't everything, but it's a bloody large part. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Andi, we can either respond if you need to now, or we can hold off. We can hear from Charles just about his initial thoughts about, again, from theory to practice in terms of the bond aggregator. What's your preference in terms of?
Happy to go to Charles.
All right, Charles, I know that, so for those of you who don't know, Charles from Northcote from Blue Chip, extensive experience in this area already, so I'm interested to hear about, I was waiting for the N-word, the NRAS word to come up. So in terms of NRAS or whatever, what's your particular take on how this is similar or different to things we've otherwise seen? What does it look like from your world?
So thank you, and thank you for having me here. I'm not Carrie, I'm not nearly as good looking, and I'm not as smart as she is, but I'll try and fill the gap. I hope Carrie's watching and gets well soon. So from an organisation, so just to paint a little bit of a picture, and when we look at these particular issues, so just for the benefit of those that don't know, Blue Chip is a community housing provider, but our focus is on the property development side, and that's where we set up about 12 years ago. And Andrew also does some of the same things. So we're always looking at how do we fill that capital stack. So it's been very much in the driver from my side in the discussions and working with Andi, and we did an initial phase, initially a couple of years before that, of this model of way of financing, because we always knew there was a gap to fit in what we're trying to do. Now, as the market's evolved, NIFIC's come in, there are other players that have come in, and that's enabled our businesses to grow and put projects on the ground. But even today, as property prices move, there's still this continual gap. And so when I look back at NRAS, quite fondly, I still have a few incentives. NRAS was good, but it was just a fixed payment, and it drove some rather interesting housing solutions. So it tended to favour the university sector, where you got studios because the payment was the same, not housing out in the community. It was cheaper you got the same payment whether you're in Tasmania, Sydney or whatever. So you got some rather bizarre outcomes, but it was still successful. It got 35,000 homes on the ground. And for those in the community housing sector who participated in that particular scheme, we're pretty much retaining what's left. The rest will be sold off, and that's going to cause what is already starting to, pushing people out into the general housing market, whereas they had that subsidy. The boost is about a long-term addition to that capital sandwich where we actually end up owning the properties, and it retains in our balance sheet, just like NRAS has enabled us to do, so that we can actually, in perpetuity, because we are charitable organisations, keep on reinvesting in property, upgrading it, turning it over, and bringing that greater number of homes to the community. Because really we're focusing about that 20% of people who will not get access to having the opportunity to buy their own home. And with the property prices moving, that gap's going to grow but even more. So if I look at how the changes have changed in a business like ours and where this will bring additionality to it, over the last 3 years, we've raised nearly $430 million worth of capital. Half of that is NIFIC, half of that is other in super funds, and this is investing in disability, social and affordable housing, and it will continue to grow. But we can only go so far. And that's the problem. Our balance sheet doesn't grow. We cannot go to the shareholders because we don't have shareholders' funds and say, we'll just take a capital rights issue, thank you very much, and then it goes to the pot. That's not the way we're legally set up as charities. So the boost is a bit like taking access like NRAS. It's taking a subsidy and putting a little bit of the cap on top. There was another discussion in the State of the Nation. It was a bit like Commonwealth Rent Assistance. If you added another, so it's roughly $70 a week. If you doubled that, that's another little bit of increment on the sandwich, plus a boost, and we're basically getting closer to be able to get these things to become sustainable. And that's, or you get a bit of land, this is how it goes. Because what do investors want? Investors want security. They want to know that they're going to get their money back. That's the first thing that they will do in that investment. So if they can get their money back, that's tick. The second thing is that cash flow steady, and it's going to happen year in, year out? Because super funds are paying out pensions, effectively, and they want a steady flow of income that they can keep paying out, and it's particularly more important as our population is ageing, the more people drawing down in those funds. So there's an inherent logic of steady, safe cash flows and then paying out those pensions, and they can guarantee that. The one thing, and Andrew really brought this home, is that when we do a boost type development, and I've certainly seen a lot of these in the US, is that the mixture of tenants that you get in there, it's not just a social housing block. You get a whole range of different people to make into that funding flow to make sure that we can pay the capital. And when Andi was talking about the up and down of the amount of gearing that you can put into it, it depends on how that structure's put together and what tenant types you have to get that cash flow. And the irony it is, and this is the thing as I'm sitting here, is that we talk a lot about negative gearing. Well, ironically, this is our industry getting a bit of a slice of that to do for the less well off. So if they're not going to take it back, well, how about our industry getting access under this type of mechanism, because that's effectively what we're doing, we're taking a tax credit to subsidise those that and put it into those that cannot afford housing. So for me, it's a smart way to create a suite of different products that we as CHPs can actually put together and fund into housing. And I think the important thing, it's only accessible to CHPs, because I think that's the critical thing, is that we need to attract funders or financiers and super funds into a well-regulated, systematic provision of money going forward. So for me, it's one more, I call it's one more arrow in my quiver that I can use to actually put projects on the ground. The benefits of what we see in this current funding from NIFIC and others, we've got something like 200 to 300 units coming out of the ground, but we need the next thing, and that's the challenge for us. What do we do next? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. Excellent. I'll just ask Wendy for a few more comments, and again, just pulls back the theory to the practical argument from a peak point of view, from a national point of view, and then we'll just get Andi to respond. And then I'm really excited to say we've got lots of questions coming through, and I strongly encourage people both here in the audience to use the app, but also those of you who are watching us remotely, absolutely important that you feel like you're part of this. We've got some great questions coming through already, and I think it's a really good opportunity. We will have a decent amount of time to ask your questions and have them answered. It doesn't always happen in conferences, but we've committed to that for this session to make sure that your questions will be answered. So, Wendy, any comments that you've got about this, and we'll just get Andi then to respond.
I just think the one thing just to that I'd like to stress is the fact that it's ongoing. So we're talking about having a tender process every year, open to all registered community housing providers, and I can see a few of our friends from NATSI here, so open to registered organisations, First Nations, people's organisations as well. And I think that ongoing nature is really important, because at the moment we've got quite a stop-start type of environment. And so when a government comes forward with an initiative, everyone feels that they have to tender because there's so little opportunity here. What we want to do here is not just give certainty to investors, and I mean, we have spoken a lot about investor needs, but we want to give certainty to our sector as well, that they can go out there, they can forge partnerships, they can talk to the community, they can talk to local government about what's needed, knowing that every year there's going to be the opportunity to tender, and tender in the areas in which you work. You don't necessarily need to expand into different areas. You can keep that local connection. You don't have to come in year one if you're not ready, because you know in year 4, 5, 6, there's going to be a tender process that you're going to be ready for. So it gives that certainty. If we combine this with a national housing strategy as well, that's looking at the condition of our existing homes, it's looking at the need out there. This is a delivery mechanism then that will help to achieve some of the objectives we'll have in the national housing strategy. So if you take anything away from this, it is a scheme that we want to be there forever, just like it is in some places. Some of you will be familiar with the low-income housing tax credit in the US. You know how long that's been there? Since the 1980s. It's seen through changes of government of very different stripes there, and it's been maintained through thick and thin. And it's become, to use Carrie's word again, normalised, something that might have been a bit complicated to begin with, but is no longer complicated, which organisations can work with and which other people understand as well.
Excellent, thanks Wendy. Andi, so just some responses to anything that Charles or Andrew or Wendy's raised, and then we'll go to these great questions that are coming up on the panel. So
I obviously liked all of the comments because they didn't say anything bad about what I'd come up with. But the important thing really is that that sort of recognition that if you can just address that funding gap, then community housing providers can do a whole lot of things themselves if that problem is taken out of the equation. So I'm very happy to hear that if such a solution is available, then this could actually work. It is something that doesn't just provide affordable housing in the short run. It's something that builds up the asset base of community housing providers and really builds it up as an asset class and as an ongoing affordable housing solution. And I think that is ultimately what we need. I mean, we have growing income gaps, we have changing labour markets, we have reluctance to build at the best of times. We got to make it as easy as possible. And by removing that fundamental gap, we are making it easier, not very easy, but easier for community housing providers to do exactly that.
excellent, thank you. All right, sorry, Charles.
If I could just add one thing to what Andi was saying, I think it's really important is that most of the audience know that the current housing stock out there is 40, 60, 80 years old and not generally in all the best of the condition. A scheme like this that goes over for 20, 30, 40 years enables you to recycle stock and continually upgrade and move with the change of accessible and requirements as people age in place and that sort of thing. So it provides, it's part of that solution to create longevity in a long-term program that gives that whole thing for investors the safe confidence that they are not just doing something for today or tomorrow. It's going to be there for decades. And that's really important when you look at housing stock, housing renewal, that whole thing every year just comes through and it's, as you say, normalised, and that's really important. And we need, there's a lot of work to be done to renew the existing portfolios.
All right, one question we've got here, and I'm happy for anyone to take it on, and it's timely at the moment, not just in the context of New South Wales, but in other jurisdictions I know. Build to rent can either be perceived as, wow, that's brand new and exciting and fantastic, we haven't had that before, all the way through to CHPs often saying, that's all we've ever done. I'm interested to hear about, particularly where we do think about build to rent absolutely working when it comes to the community housing providers, but not necessarily at the moment, in certainly New South Wales, something that's being absolutely endorsed as much as the market might have thought. Any ideas about how the build to rent sector, and that means REITs effectively, private equity, how that might factor as part of this, as distinct from necessarily having to have CHPs as in the driving seat? And I know, just commenting on Wendy's point, the big tax credit system in the US doesn't have a CHP mechanism as part of it. It's a direct tax offset. It doesn't have this extra layer of certainty to make sure that those tax incentives or private wins are benefiting publicly. Any thoughts from anyone about build to rent and how this influences or not as part of the bond aggregator?
I'll answer. Look, build to rent is, it's nothing new. Build to rent, particularly in the US market, is very much aimed at not the upper end of high net worth renters. It's what they call multifamily. The markets are very different in the US to here in Australia, so it's a very entrenched product and there's a lot of large players. The birth of the so-called private sector build-to-rent market is not without its challenges, and some of it's been seen as high net worth renters who want to pay above market rents for renting. That's obviously not where we would position the market. I think it will happen, but I think it's quite challenging to make the numbers work. And certain Queensland and other governments have looked to incentivise part of those programs going forward. But it is quite a challenge with the current market conditions to actually make the whole thing stack up. That's the key.
Thanks, Charles. Andi.
I think also in sort of designing this for around CHOs, that provides, in terms of that affordability perspective, a much longer time horizon, beyond the 20 years. In the build-to-rent sector, if this would be easily applicable to the build-to-rent sector, but you come to that 20-year threshold, and what happens then to the properties after the 20-year threshold. So NRES lasted for 10 years, this is 20 years. Okay, it's better, but it's not in perpetuity. What building it up around the community housing sector enables is that the stock that is invested in today is a solution to long-term, ongoing availability of affordable housing.
And just why CHOs, they're regulated. That's the first thing. So we can reduce compliance costs for this scheme because they're regulated. We can be more confident that the outcomes will be good for the tenants that move into them because they're regulated. We can get lower rates of return. The investors require lower rates of return because we're regulated. So I think that's why we've really focused on this, going through registered CHOs of any type. And it's not a fixed market, it's an open market. People can register to become community housing organisations, but they need to have a mission to provide housing for lower income households. Want to do that.
Andrew.
I would just say that there's a fundamental difference between affordable build-to-rent and market build-to-rent. On the market build-to-rent side, I mean, many organisations through no government action will make a commercial decision that that's a better risk-adjusted return is to hold the product long-term given certain market cycles, and we've seen that. We've seen increasing companies sort of choose to do that rather than to build to sell. So that's going to exist in its own right. The affordable build-to-rent, I mean, this is the core business of community housing providers, I would argue, and has been for a long time. Where things get perverse is that if there's government incentives and subsidies being provided to for-profit developers to do market build-to-rent, and that's happening at the expense of potentially those subsidies flowing to a community housing provider or the community housing sector for all the benefits that Wendy sort of highlighted, then that's a really perverse outcome. The other perverse outcome is if they're providing, governments are choosing to provide such incentives or subsidies conditional upon a requirement that a very small takeout of the build-to-rent stock is for affordable purposes. I've heard of some governments contemplating potentially, well, yes, we've got a requirement for certain amount, we want to have some affordable rental in there, but maybe we won't use the typical definition in the community housing sector of which tends to be 74.9% of market rent. We'll come up with some new definition that maybe it's like a 10% discount to market rent. And so I think there's real potential and danger for governments to make some poor policy decisions that fail to capture the benefits of the community housing sector and fail to deliver social and affordable rental properties. Yep.
Thank you. Look, one of the a few questions have come here, very much focusing on, which I'll get to, about size and scale. We've all heard about how you need size and scale, but lots of questions about, well, what happens if you're a small CHO or CHP? What happens for the smaller Aboriginal providers? Just before we get to that, and I'm sure each will have a response to that, one of the things that, Andrew, you've just touched on is this 74.99. To the best of my knowledge, that figure doesn't in and of itself demonstrate affordability. It, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, is really about being subservient to what would otherwise be the PBI status compliance. That's really where that figure came from. In the same way that you say, well, 10% might be better, we probably should be saying that for something to be affordable, it should be 2/3. I mean, there's just as much merit. I mean, this is not the day to have that discussion, but I'm always interested about the 74.99 or the 75, as if in itself has become tested. It's not really from a space of affordability. It comes from a particular ruling around tax, is what I understand. Any thoughts on that before we get to the scale and size for the smallest?
Look, I would sort of start, John, by just saying that community housing providers typically have two eligibility criteria hurdles, and in terms of in terms of their rent setting policy. So yeah, 74.9% is treat that as a cap. So the rent's going to be no higher than that. But it's also subject to not putting a tenant into housing stress. So you've also got, like a floor, which is like 30% of someone's gross income. And so many community housing providers, and CHC certainly does it, and I don't think we stand alone. Yeah, we don't charge 74.9% of market rent on many of our properties. It's a figure below that because of catering to not put someone in housing stress.
Any other comments on that PBI number, and then we'll get to the smaller housing providers?
Not specifically on the PBI number, but I can say that in terms of how the scheme would work, or how this solution would work, it is agnostic really to what you set that affordability level at. Yep. So if you were to change the definitions of what affordability is going forward, you don't have to change a thing about this solution. It would work with any threshold that you might put on it. In our modelling, we've based it on 50-50 social housing, which is not a market-determined rate, but it's determined out of income, and the remainder is set as a discount to market rents. But really, this solution adjusts to whatever level or depth of affordability you want to put. You can have annual or state-wise or particular areas of states having priorities around particular affordability depth levels. That is, it adjusts to all of that seamlessly.
Any other comments, Charles or Wendy, about that tax setting, that magical number that's become orthodoxy?
Not really. I just made me recall what Andrew said. I was looking at the first 5 years as I was just thinking back on our NRAS. I think our average market rental percentage was about 63% of market in the way that we juggled to get the right outcomes. And so whilst now the market's moved where you're right at that top echelon because you need to be able to make the deal stack. The dynamics have changed from where they were 10 years ago. So those are the environmental rules that we play within, whether they're right, wrong, or whatever. That's the environment that it has a. It's a bit like one of these things, as you rightly point out. Is it right or wrong? That's not really the point. That's what the investors understand in terms of certainty that's going to go along for the next 10 years unless there's a major government policy change. That's critical for them in terms of understanding the security of cash flows that they're flowing through.
The other thing I'd just add is the design that Andy's come up with is not a fixed subsidy that you're bidding for. So you're putting in the tender as a CHO, you know where it is, you know the incomes roughly of the people you're going to house. Then the bid you put in for that gap funding is going to reflect that. So we know that, say, in the centre of Sydney, at least one provider said to me the average in one scheme is 51% discount to market. Just no other way of housing people that, is part of their mission.
All right, thanks for that. A few questions have come in, and one from Francesca. Frankie, I think, about how can small providers compete? So any comments from each of you just briefly even about, is this something that, and I know the conversation has been happening increasingly around this table around, do we have to talk necessarily about amalgamation of smaller providers? Blue Chip's a good example of where there's a way you can do it. Just comments about how the smaller CHOs, particularly Aboriginal housing organisations, for example, might be able to also benefit just as equally. Is there an alternative to the scale argument?
So in terms of how this is designed, it is designed to, from an investment perspective, be agnostic to the size of the development that goes ahead. So the investor invests in the annual fund that the aggregator has put together, and the aggregator then distributes those to successful bidders. So this is really an issue of whether a small provider puts in a tender and a competitive tender is also able to layer in additional forms of support. And it then puts forward what is the funding gap to provide, whether it's Aboriginal housing, whether it's any other particular tenancy group that is targeted. It is small scale, large scale. From an investment perspective, that is unaffected. It's really from whether you can manage to crowd in the additional funding sources to make your bid competitive. And that means reaching out to philanthropy, getting state support, obviously own equity, and other forms of concessions that bring down what that funding gap is, because that's ultimately the assessment of what is a competitive bid. And then you might say, well, you might end up with competitive bids that are equally good, but one actually targets a group of people that is particularly in need, and one targets people that are in need but not as in much need. It's a terrible way to think about things, but you can easily build into this weights, if you will. If you have from a state perspective or from an area perspective have particular priorities or groups that should be targeted, you can easily provide build in weights that then differentiates between how bids are assessed in terms of value for money.
Excellent, thanks.
The idea is
Can I
absolutely...
just say something else as well? This is a funding model, and it's got to sit within other system changes as well. So we're talking about a national housing strategy. So this is a funding mechanism that would fund objectives there. So what if that national housing strategy had a First Nation people strategy? Then what would that require? It needs funding, and I would argue that this is a mechanism that would work to fund First Nations housing. But you'd also be looking at capacity building. I'm not talking about capability, I'm talking about capacity building here. You would be looking at what the priorities are you want to the strategy, and I would have thought that First Nations housing would be one of the things. So when we came to the tender process, it could be that there would be priorities for providing First Nations housing in particular locations. You might be looking there at a number of community-controlled organisations having a slice of that pie. So it isn't the full answer to everything out there, but it would work with those other elements that we would need to solve the housing problems.
Thanks, Wendy. Andrew, anything about the scale of the small operators?
Look, I was just going to say, look, in addition to CHC, I'm also on the board of Chair. So most of Chair's members by number are in fact Tier 3 providers and some Tier 2 providers. So they don't traditionally do development activity. Many of those are in regional areas. The one thing we're doing in the ACT is that we're trying to work together as community housing providers. We're the smallest jurisdiction, we've got one layer of government, so often the ACT can be a good place to pilot things, but we sit around the table and there's a case in point of a particular project. There's 4 providers. We're all banding together to try to produce an outcome and to try to get a concession from government. And we all see power in coming together. Some of the partners haven't done development before. Some have done heaps. Some have really strong relationships with government, and others may be weaker. So there's all sorts of reasons to come together. And so for some of the smaller community housing providers, in the context of what we're talking about today, I would encourage them to look to some of the larger community housing providers in their jurisdiction, in their area, and try to come up with something innovative together.
Charles, anything about scale or size?
Yeah, I think that what Andrew says, we're a pretty collaborative sector. We can be a bit like seagulls going after the chips, when there's just not much scraps on the ground to go for these sort of things. And there is that competitiveness in there, which is driven a lot by the very tender value for money treasury type sort of situation, which doesn't necessarily give the best long-term outcomes. But I'm always of the view that there's enough expertise within the sector, and if you're an organisation where you have gaps, you can go and find it. You don't have to get EY or KPMG, much as I have nothing against them, but you can get the real expertise of the people who are doing it. They're there, and it's that's what we're there for as a sector. And that's sort of how our organisation, we've got skills in particular areas. We outsource the tenancy and asset management because that's not our core business. So it's really important that people understand what they're good at and what they're not good at. And when we go and source people who do it really well, and that gives us very high levels of tenant satisfaction and occupancy rates. So it's part of an organisation's understanding that core, what they're good at, where they need to source expertise, and who to go and get it from.
Thank you. I'll move across to the political question, which is probably the elephant in the room. These things are great in theory. How do we translate it from practical theory to not just something that could work, but something that's politically palatable? And I'm thinking of quoting, I think it's Dr. Cameron Murray, who often says, if government wants to do something, it's called investing. When it doesn't, it's called a cost to government. Is there a way in which, and one of the questions is talking about this, how are we going to make, so Richard's asked, why is meeting the funding gap through a tax credit going to be more palatable to government than funding it through a direct subsidy? Any comments about the political environment and how this may or may not fly, either currently or with an impending change of government? Any thoughts about that from anyone? I might start with Wendy, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think any type of ongoing subsidy, whether it's a tax credit or cash, is difficult. It is difficult. It's one of the reasons that we decided, rather than just asking for the resource, that we would come up with something that made it easier for government. It's not the only piece of work we're doing. We're also looking at and this morning we were talking about a little bit in the State of the Nation, and picking up on just what you said. There's a cost to government, but there are lots of benefits that come, and yes, some of those benefits are over the longer term, but we're doing work on that. It is difficult in this particular environment, but I think it's easier when you can show that you've got a lot of the partners on board already, and that government is really just the missing partner here. And I think what's been positive in the last couple of years is that a number of the state governments now, not just Victoria, but Queensland and Tasmania are doing initiatives as well. And even in New South Wales with the Community Housing Innovation Fund, the SHIF, there's signs that the states are actually stepping up. So we think we're increasing that band of brothers and sisters along the line. We've got an election coming up. We spoke about that this morning. It is an opportunity to start talking more loudly about that money question and not avoiding the money question. The reason we're here today is we're hoping to persuade the people sitting in this room who are probably going to be the best advocates that there are to talk about it as a solution as well. If we don't get the money this time, let's argue for a housing strategy which gives us a structured process to talk about that money issue as well. Yeah.
Andrew, from an ACT point of view, is there anything different, and we might talk about local government for a sec, but either Andrew or Charles, anything about the political environment that lends weight to either a particular mode or just the bond aggregator, sorry, the boost generally? Who politically likes this? How can we make it fly more?
I mean, I think from a state or territory government perspective, anything further from the federal government, in addition to the, as I said before, the great success that has been NIFIC and the cheap concessional finance for CHPs, and anything further than that, makes it would be well received, obviously, by the states and territories.
Charles, anything from you?
I think there's. Wendy was really onto this, is that programs that are classified as welfare and those sorts of programs, they can get chopped quite quickly, but if you've got something coming out of Treasury via a tax subsidy and it's in finance, a bit like NIFIC is, you actually have got more chance of it happening, and it has more likely to stay there, whereas the spurts of funding we see to, whether it's a 15,000 housing credit and everyone goes and upgrades their kitchens or whatever, they're one-offs, whereas if you entrench it into part of the tax and ongoing system, it's less. I mean, this is the whole debate of negative gearing. It's been really hard if someone wants to, now we won't touch it, but it's in the system. So if you can embed something in the system, which the Americans have done with exactly the same, getting both sides, it's too hot to handle, it then has that longevity. So I think it has, from a political aspect point of view, once it's seated in there, it will stay in there.
All right, I'm going to come back. Oh, sorry, Andy, you go.
Can I just add to that? I think this is also about kind of normalising institutional investors' participation in investment in social and affordable housing. And by structuring it this way, it brings in that sector, it allows that additional learning, it allows that competency building also in the super sector and institutional investors that hopefully over time will make it very clear that this is a low-risk investment. You can actually go in directly and invest and build at scale, become an equity operator. So I think that there are longer term additional benefits in terms of structuring it as a tax credit that go beyond the actual financial finikities of it, but how the sector goes forward and how we bring together institutional investors into this conversation on an ongoing basis.
And it's all about leverage. I mean, it's all about, not all the funding's obviously coming from federal government, but by having this tax credit regime that's hard to unwind, then it's about bringing in all the institutional capital, which is exactly aligned with the independent review of NIFIC and what they sort of said was needed to sort of bring in other sources of capital. I mean, this is a way of doing it. It's a precipitator for that.
On that note, it's often said that we've got in 3 levels of government, we've got one too many. We just can't decide on which one we don't need. When we see that this is a very you're right. When we see that this is aimed at that idea of the Commonwealth government tax, I'm enamoured by the changes that were made, even in New South Wales at least. So we had local government elections in early December last year. Very different responses from particular councils, very different about their commitment to, and I think there's a couple of people in the room here who know and were part of, councils committing to affordable housing being provided. So one council at one end of a part of New South Wales, nothing to see here, we can't provide, all the way through to, here's a piece and a parcel of land that we are going to assign to you. We see us as being critical as a layer of government in the provision and the supply of new affordable housing. I'm interested to see whether or not there's different thoughts or ideas about how local government, not who you would normally think of when we're thinking about these things, but how local government might be the thing that tips these things over and makes them work in a way they might not otherwise. Any thoughts on that from anyone in particular, local government?
That, to me, is the pink in that, I don't know whether we can put that up, but in that stack. And for me, that's where we can deal with our local government organisation, councils and that sort of thing, or whether it's part of the planning scheme in those particular areas for voluntary contributions, or there could be mandatory contributions like in Sydney. So those sorts of things can engender different parts of the pink that actually make those things, and you're bringing jobs and growth to those local areas, which is really important. So it's really key.
Absolutely. Wendy or Andrew, and then we'll...
No, I was just going to say, it's the pink layers, and look, it's really key, and it's really key that, and this program's been designed not to displace the need for those planning concessions, those density bonuses, that the things that sit within the remit of the planners of a particular jurisdiction. It's about locking them all in, and then it's that piece on top to make it all fly.
And I mean, many of them, if you've had the pleasure of reading some of the submissions to the Felinsky inquiry into housing supply, if you look at most of the local government ones, they're talking about low-income households not being able to get affordable accommodation, about them wanting to grow their economies and not being able to attract younger people who can't afford to buy into their homes. So they themselves are screaming out for a much more diverse range of housing there. So they're going to be ideal partners to put in tenders with, I suspect. Some of them have got land, but it's not developable land in its current condition, and this could knock it.
Andy, anything on that at all? We might move on.
I can mostly reiterate Charles' point there about this sits in the pink layer, and the objective here is really to crowd in as much of those contributions as possible to bring down what that gap is. Ultimately, if you're not able to crowd in anything, then it's not a very competitive bid, of course. But there are lots of layers, different layers. It doesn't have to be a particular stack of layers. It's really about what you can crowd in and what is its impact on the funding gap that matters.
I'm interested on the thought that's been touched on a bit too about industry super generally, or superannuations and their ability to either be the absolute answer as part of this, or them being loyal to having to provide bottom line return for their, for their investors or for their contributors, and that's it. Where do you think there might be some work, or we could push the argument to say, organisations who themselves are made up of large aged care or carer providers, people who actually are on modest incomes, low super, you would think when we're talking about attracting an investment that has a natural nexus between that which they do and the investment that they do, i.e. key worker housing for the very people that they themselves have as members. Is there any work that we could do there? And I apologise that Carrie's not here to talk about this, or rather Gemma. But yeah, I'm interested in the range, or what else that the big superannuation companies could do to be directly putting skin in the game. And it touches on ethical investment, I suppose. But any thoughts about superannuation generally and how it's sort of missing from this discussion a bit about key worker housing?
I think they're governed by that they've got to get those sort of highest and best returns. So that's most probably the first thing, and that is the directors or the trustees of those funds' duty. I think where it becomes extremely interesting is the rise of, we talk about ESG, sustainable, environmental and other types of funding, which are in quite a lot of cases prepared to take a lower return for that benefit that they're doing to the community. And so one of the interesting things, and in discussions I was talking a couple of years ago with Morgan Stanley, and I think from memory it was like there's this wealth transfer coming through the baby boom generation of, I think it was $30 trillion. And the people that are looking to invest, or where they want their money, is into more ESG type sort of investments. So I think and some of the counterparties I've dealt with who that's very important as part of their mandate. It's still tricky to get it all lined up, and we've got some way to go on that. But I think it is still challenging for the super. I mean, it makes inherent sense that they should be funding the people that actually provide housing. I have no dispute on that logic, and have talked to a lot of them about that. But federal government has legislated this is the return, and they've obviously pushed that quite hard with cleaning up poor performing funds, so there's more pressure on that. So the question is, what is the return, and how's return measured? Is it just dollars and cents, or is it added value within the community? Those are those different things that need to be thought about.
Yeah, I mean, John, they've got this thing called the sole purpose test. Yeah. So the investment they make has to be to the benefit of their members. So yeah, the affordable housing might be a benefit to the members, but only those members who are housed. So they have got two sorts of investment. They've got their real estate. So they have been investing in some affordable housing, but it's like Andrew was talking about, it's for 10 years and then you make a return on the capital gain. What we designed for them is something that taps into their low risk bit of their investment portfolio. So low returns so that we're not paying too much for the capital, but we have to make it low risk, which is what this does, because they're not directly investing in any one project or scheme. Yeah.
Andi, then Andrew.
So I'm going to use the expression you just used to take a direct skin in the game. What this is setting up is a way to avoid direct or skin in the game by investing in that housing without being exposed to any fluctuations in the rental stream or the operational risks that come with that. That's often a question that comes up in a lot of the conversations that we had with Super about, well, but what happens to our returns when there's variation in tenant profile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't affect the return that the investor gets. The counterparty is the Australian Tax Office. This is a secure stream. They don't have to worry about fluctuations in the rental scheme, in rental incomes. And the benefit of that over time is precisely that we now begin to normalise the involvement of institutional investors in social and affordable housing, and hopefully they'll feel compelled to then take direct or have skin in the game directly later on. But this is a learning process on two parts.
Okay. Andrew, and then I'm going to ask about some rural housing or regional housing and the opportunities there. Andrew?
So I was just going to build on Charles's point about the ESG side of things and just the opportunity that is. And whenever we think about scale investment in our sector, institutional investment in the sector, you know, there's a real opportunity there which is known and recognised certainly from a sector peak body perspective, and there's active work underway that maybe Wendy will touch on, so that as a sector we can talk more and create those linkages for fund managers about, you know, delivering social and affordable rental housing and the ESG credentials that kind of come with that. And I mean, Australia tends to lag other Western sort of countries, and you know, the stuff we saw firsthand in the US a couple of years ago, Charles. I mean, the ESG space over there and in the UK is just enormous, and the linkage to housing, the social and affordable rental housing, has been made, and you've got fund managers who are wanting a slice of the pie to allocate to that. So I think in terms of what good looks like, I mean, I think that's kind of where we need to get to here. And I'm sure if Gemma was here and Carrie, etc., that they'd be probably talking more about that. But not sure, did you want to touch on, Wendy, at the risk of putting you on the spot?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't quite launched it, but we're actually doing a project. We've actually got now 20 community housing organisations, another band that we're setting up actually. We're really into, you know, setting up bands. We'll be able to have a competition soon between the bands. But so this band is 20 CHOs that we've signed up, and there's still room for more, so just come and see me after the presentation. But what we're doing is we're combining resources to come up with what we call a sustainability reporting framework. So any investor who comes to us and invests in community housing is going to be able to demonstrate the value of that investment to the people that are putting money into their funds. So we'll be looking at environmental, social and governance standards. So it'll be the sector that will come up with a common framework so that we can actually aggregate those results as well and demonstrate what that investment does. So that's the ESG reporting framework that we'll be producing. We've got our consultants, we've got NIFIC on board. Nathan sort of mentioned it this morning as well, a number of other partners and 20 CHOs, so we're still building on that one, yeah.
Last 10 minutes, so a couple more questions if you've got the opportunity to put them in now, otherwise we'll go through the ones we've got. Just one thing that keeps coming up, and it's come up with a few questions, so Anonymous, just about regional housing. I know that you've said it can be anywhere, but is there some great benefit here? Are we looking at a great opportunity to really apply the aggregator, the boost, to the particular issue that we're seeing around regional housing, rents in particular rising, and the opportunity for CHPs who may not even be in those areas yet to really take advantage of this using this particular tool? Any thoughts on regional housing need and what the pandemic has created as some possible opportunities? Any thoughts on that?
So as part of our portfolio, we have quite a regional bit running down the south coast of New South Wales. So we see a product like this provides us that extra bit that can actually get that across the line. And it's very interesting, the way that we're going to manage the post-pandemic and the regional housing markets, I think is something now that with something like this will give us more ability to develop that. And that's that point of also the pink, you can get to the local councils often, or there's that block of land, we can't do anything with it, we might be able to do something with it. It does depend on the local area. So the challenges with regional areas has been the decline over the last 30 or 40 years has made some of that quite challenging in certain smaller towns, but the super regionals, absolutely, there is significant opportunity there right now to do that with something like this and make a big difference.
Excellent. Wendy.
Can I just say one thing? The other thing is, I'm going to come back to that ongoing nature. So if you think about if we'd had the boost in place and we're coming up new financial year, we've got a new tender round, you know, we've just got these massive floods, we've got a major issue there. This is a scheme that's, we don't have to devise it, it's up there and running, and the priorities that year probably would be putting some of those problems right. And the same with regional housing prices. Yeah,
exactly.
Flexibility.
Yeah, it's an opportunity, certainly. Andrew, anything from you from the Queen Bee in Canberra We often talk about that part of the world. Canberra's problems around housing and housing affordability aren't restricted to the ACT borders.
Yeah, no, that's true. CHC only currently develops within the ACT. I mean, I talked before about community housing providers in the ACT. We're very collaborative, and Charles touched on the collaborative nature of our sector overall. I mean, I'm not sure if Caroline's here, but so Argyle Housing, and they operate in the regions. They engage with the local councils around New South Wales. I think Wagga, Yass, some other publicly sort of known developments that they're doing, and I think in terms of all, I think we know that rents in some of these regional areas, as a consequence of what's happened in the last 2 years, have just gone crazy in some of those locations, and so as Wendy said, if you can sort of this program, this can be targeted, the levers can be pulled by federal government in terms of the the prioritisation, and it can leverage those local government contributions as well. So I think it can only help address the regional housing need.
Any other comments? And we might then move to next steps. Just quickly, 30 seconds each, something just about shared equity seems to be this thing that we wrestle with, like assisted home ownership, all of these things. The 20-year rather than the 10-year NRAS, so does the 20-year, for example, lend itself to a scheme that says, well, at the end of that particular life of that property or that particular incentive, is there some opportunity to rather than these things just dropping at year 20 like they do at year 10, is there a possibility to work with this scheme and others to make it so we've got a bit of a softer landing? Does the 20-year time frame allow that more or less, or does it make no difference?
Well, I think the beauty of designing this scheme in the way it is, with CHOs as the primary kind of takers of it, is that when you come to that 20-year period, they still can't go to market rent, precisely for the reasons that we talked about previously. So you avoid that, and you leave a lot more options, that the stock is debt-free after 20 years. So you can make a choice in terms of how you want to reinvest that, and you can either reinvest it in new stock or upgrading, etc., the way Charles explained earlier. So you have a lot more flexibility after 20 years of retaining that stock as affordable stock in perpetuity.
Andrew or Charles or Wendy, just about, I know that NRAS sort of sits in that we haven't paid down necessarily despite the good incentives for 10 years, we're still left with a bit of a balloon payment on some properties. Does this answer that for you guys as operators?
Oh, look, it does for me. I think the key thing, as Andi mentioned, is that these are properties held by the community housing provider, and I mean, the community housing provider involvement in NRAS was the shining light of NRAS, because most of that stock is remaining in the sector, or is being redeveloped to produce more social affordable rental housing elsewhere. So, I mean, this scheme has factored that in, and the residual debt at year 20 would be very low, and would be very much within the capacity of the majority of community housing providers to retain, as was done through NRAS.
Good. Charles, anything on your NRAS?
I think there's a couple of key parts to this. One is that we end up with the housing at the end, pretty much on our balance sheet. There's flexibility to do that. But I think also the important thing is at the beginning. We talk about that build to rent sector. Well, we do that. We understand what materials, what things you need to build in to reduce maintenance costs over the 20-year period. So the quality of build that we put into our buildings is all about designing out maintenance, designing out things that will break, use the right materials. Well, buildings I'm building now, we are putting in solar, we are doing all sorts of different things. I actually talked to one of my guys and said, well, we better make sure that every car park has a power point by it, because, in 20 years' time, we might be just plugging in the car overnight. These are things that, because our development and holding lifetime is a lot longer than other investors, we are thinking of those long-term situations and can make that style of investment that holds that. Your point about shared equity, that would have to be a different scheme. It could be featured on part of that, but it would have to be a bolt-on. I'm always one, don't overcook the complications in the cake that you're trying to do. Just make sure it's got 2 tiers, not 10, because every time you add complexity, you add lawyer costs, everything else like that goes with it, consultants, you name it. And the point is what we want in this is to go indefinitely. So the simpler it is, the more likely that's to happen, and the more greater success rate you have in terms of participation, and you can adapt it, as Wendy said. We've got terrible floods. We've had bushfires. There's a whole raft of different things that you can pull levers on. That allocation's going to this region, or this greater region, and work on those sorts of things, which is a far more adept policy instrument that can change with times.
So the program design is quite different to, and Charles and I heard firsthand a couple of years ago in the US about the LITAC scheme and the challenges providers were facing at that terminal date of the scheme, and it just struck me that there was significant variability in terms of what that actually meant. I mean, for some providers, they were sitting pretty where they were, and that they would get the ownership, but for seemingly the vast majority, that was in third-party hands, and there was certainly no guarantees it would remain in the sector, which then just creates a bigger problem because then you've got to replace that plus be additive on top of that.
Wendy, anything finally, and then we'll just do a quick little wrap-up, couple of minutes to go. I think we've answered everyone's questions. Thanks to you at remotely watching us. We've certainly enjoyed the opportunity to answer your questions as well. Just in one statement, if you had a magic wand and you could say, this is going to push through, we're going to make this particular scheme, this particular idea push through, what's the one thing or the one ingredient, to use Charles's cake analogy, that do you think is needed to get this across the line? Charles, we'll start with you.
So to get it across the line, it's harnessing the dissatisfaction we have in society about people not being able to afford housing or rental, or stress that people are under. Like, I was just seeing at breakfast, and I know it's only 30 seconds, a guy walks down the street and just with his tracky dacks on, nothing on top, nothing on the bottom. I'm thinking, man, we're back to this again. We got everyone off the street. We're just back to where we were. And even walking around Melbourne streets last night, there's a lot more homeless on the street. That's the bottom end, but we've got to pick up all the bits along the way to give people more housing security. And this is one of the key elements of doing that.
Excellent, Charles. Andrew.
And I think linked to that, I would just say bold leadership by political leaders, irrespective of what colour they are.
Wendy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm there, and I think building on that, it's us talking about it all the time and not being scared to say we need money. You know, we are a very good sector at trying to make do with what we've got, but I think all of us saying we could do so much more, and you would benefit government long term as well.
Excellent. Andi, from your final word.
I think to get it across the line, the key thing is to focus on what is the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is the gap. Address the gap. Don't fiddle about with all the different layers and a little bit of percentage point here or a percentage point there, $10 extra here or $10 off there. Go to the gap, address the gap, and then you can deal with the rest.
Oh, Andi, that's a great note to finish on, and I'm going to say, mind the gap is definitely something we could borrow from overseas. I think that's going to be what I'm going to use. Would you please join me in thanking Charles, Andrew, Wendy and Andi. Thanks very much for your attendance, everyone. And again, to people at home watching remotely, we certainly hope that you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you very much, everyone.